May I now call upon the first speaker, the proposition to begin today's debate.
They are the masters of their fate. They are the captains of their soul. In Iraq, when the Kurds' request for independence was met with chlorine gas attacks and met with a genocide, think that the right to independent statehood is necessary to protect the core of humanity. Let's look at the key terms in today's debate. By region, refer to a distinct locality with different demographics. For instance, individuals who are culturally distinguishable or ethnically different. Each region faces different concerns and specific issues pertaining to that particular region, and they are therefore unique from the rest of the nation. Independent statehood simply refers to the right to self-governance, where the particular region is now able to decide on their own government and to decide on policies that are beneficial to them. This is essentially a form of secession, which means that a region will be established with distinct territorial borders as a sovereign, autonomous country. A majority of people refer to over 50% of individuals living in a particular region who decide that they want to secede. This is usually determined through the use of a plebiscite. Today's debate must take place in an evaluative framework where both sides must prove why giving them the right to secede is principally more just. Both sides must debate on whether these regions have the inherent right to secede and not whether secession in and of itself is a good thing. As the first speaker, I'll be telling you about the right to self-determination, secondly, about saving lives, and lastly, about the failure of representation. My second speaker will tell you about incentivizing governmental action and preventing terrorism. On my first point, on the right to self-determination, the thesis is this. Each individual and region should be granted the fundamental right to self-determination so as to shape their own identity and future. The ability of an individual, I'll take in a moment, to decide on his own future and with whom he chooses to associate himself with is fundamental in shaping his own future. But before I go on, yes?
Madam, for people are ethnically unique, but they still believe they have the right to form a new national community. Why won't you allow them to?
Then we think that's perfectly fine as well. We will allow people who aren't ethnically unique to form their own nation. This is not something that we have said that we stand against. Because we see, even if they aren't ethnically unique, we realize the fact that they want to secede and leave the nation means there's some sort of failure in representation, means that these people are feeling uncared for under the current regime. And therefore, in order to protect these people, even if they aren't distinct ethnically, we think they have distinct concerns, and that's why we allow them to secede as well. That's your point dealt with. Back to my argument. Therefore, we see this very simply because an individual's identity cannot be determined by someone else or imposed upon. Because this is something that forms a core part of his life, something that affects his daily decisions. Therefore, we see that individuals should have the right to self-determination by deciding for themselves whether or not they want to be part of the collective body of the nation. This right extends to communities as well, which are comprised of individuals who identify themselves as distinct from the rest of the region. This can only be achieved by giving them the right to independent statehood, because it means now the identity is not contingent on the vote of the majority like it would be under opposition, but rather comprised of those within the region. No. In the absence of the right to self-determination, others are capable of asserting ownership over these individuals, forcing them to stay in the nation against their will. Therefore, their fate and identity is crafted by others within the country, stripping them of the fundamental right of being able to decide something as important as their own future and identity. This is something we cannot stand for. This is something upheld in the UN Charter, Chapter 1, Article 1, Part 2, where it states that states and individuals have the right to self-determination. And we see, therefore, that this principle is in line with internationally upheld standards and something the proposition is incredibly proud to stand for. On my second point, on saving lives, no. The thesis of my argument is this. The ability to form an independent state best were ignored, this empowered the Burman majority to continue abusing the Rohingya, resulting in thousands of deaths each year, because now the Burmese know that this Rohingya can never get away, they don't have the threat of secession. And that is why their side killed the 83,000 Rohingya that died in 2012. Instead, we see how this is good when the Muslim Bosnian minority within Yugoslavia was subject to widespread abuse by majority Christians. This resulted in 1995 Bosnian genocide, and this abuse was only stopped when Bosnia could actually break away from Yugoslavia, establishing a separate state where they were actually protected. Therefore, outside save lives. No. On to my next point on the failure of representation. The thesis is this: the unique concerns of a region are only truly represented by those living there. The concerns of each region are distinct because we recognize each region and locality has different needs and issues, be it because of cultural differences, ethnic differences, or simply concerns that are more specific to that region. Individuals in the region are therefore the ones who face these problems and issues regarding the specific region on a daily basis. They have the most experience and are thus best placed to make their own decisions and own policies. Within an independent state on proposition, they are able to achieve better representation when their concerns can be reflected in governmental policy. We argue on opposition, even under a benevolent government, other individuals within the country cannot sufficiently represent these individuals because they don't have the unique representation. Therefore, we argue on their side, there's a failure of democracy when your small minority groups cannot ever get a say in governmental policy. We saw this in Timor-Leste, where they are unable to achieve representation as part of Indonesia due to their status as minority Christians in an Islamic state. The Timor-Leste political parties were small and didn't achieve representation, culminating in 100,000 deaths. Because a man ceases to be a man when he can no longer decide, I'm proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 15 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech. I now call upon the first speaker of the opposition to give his speech.
Don't be fooled by rhetoric on side proposition about saving lives, because we tell you that allowing secession of individual regions only worsens interstate conflicts and costs the lives of more people. Three main points of contention for the House today. First, on their policy. Second, on the right to self-determination, where I'll be dealing with their first and third substantives. And lastly, on saving lives, where I'll be dealing with her second substantive. First, on the idea of policy, we asked them, well, will they have a criteria for economic viability of independent states? Because if they don't, then these states are almost bound to fail, and people are going to descend into instability and violence that they talked about. Second, we find it strange that they would define regions as areas that are ethnically and culturally different, and yet in a POI response, claim that you don't need to be ethnically or culturally different to form an independent state. We see this as a contradiction on their policy. Second, let's deal with the argument about the right to self-determination. What was their first substantive? They told us that individuals have a right to self-determination over their own identity, and therefore it should extend to communities. We find this a very vague first principle, because we say the desire to create your own unique identity, meaning to rule over my life, does not include the ability to form a sovereign state. For instance, I may not agree with everything my government does. I may want to fulfill my own identity, but this does not translate into being able to say, you know, I want to fulfill my identity, so I should be able to create my own independent state. That was the logic that they never proved to us, that the right to your own identity should include into legal representation on sovereignty. Next, they give us this strange argument that every region has different needs. Ladies and gentlemen, that is why we have democratic representation of individual states and regions in parliaments. That's why we have federalism to grant regions autonomy. But what they don't understand is that their argument is an argument for breaking up every single state entirely, when in status quo, regions submit themselves to federal control because certain things like national defense and foreign policy cannot be done by individual regions themselves. Second, let's deal with this idea about saving lives immediately. Now let's understand that they're not fulfilling their burden of promotion because hold on a moment, madam, not every seceding state is under the threat of genocide. I'll give you the example of Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, which aren't under the threat of genocide of an ethnic minority. Yes, madam?
Unfortunately, in Burma, in 2012, 83,000 Rohingya died. Tell us why you deny them the right to life.
And we are going to explain to you how none of those Rohingyas would have been saved even with your policy of seceding right now. Firstly, we argue that your policy leads to otherization. I'll be elaborating on this in my substantive, but suffice to say your inter-community ethnic violence will only translate into interstate ethnic violence the moment these ethnic minorities form an independent country, which we say magnifies the number of people who die. But second, we argue that their policy, their principle, is infinitely elastic because just because you are a minority under oppression does not in legal terms translate into your ability to form an independent state. Would they grant, for instance, homosexuals under Uganda the right to form an independent state simply because they are a minority under oppression? Obviously not, right? So what do we want on our counter policy for today? We do not support the unilateral secession of any region within a sovereign nation. Secession can occur if the sovereign government of the territory recognizes the region as an independent state after holding a referendum or diplomatic negotiations. Therefore, this debate is about regions that want to secede that the sovereign government does not allow them to. We will grant autonomy and devolve parliamentary powers to regions such as Scotland and the United Kingdom. We'll be arguing our case in three main points of substantive. Firstly, we argue that sovereignty is a national right. Secondly, that seceding states lack independence viability. And my second speaker will be arguing that they worsen local oppression. First, that sovereignty is a national right. We have to argue here that the right of nations to self-determination goes hand in hand with the right to national sovereignty. Yes, madam?
Tell us why these abusive governments that torture the people deserve the right to sovereignty.
They deserve, not the abusive government doesn't deserve the right to sovereignty, and the international community should do something about it through the form of sanctions and other international pressure. But this does not translate into denying the government the right to control over its sovereign territory by allowing balkanization and the formation of sovereign independent states that have no basis on international law. Now, we argue that self-determination and sovereignty go hand in hand because sovereignty stems from the right of nations to self-determination, because self-determination grants nations the right of self-governance of a national community without interference or aggression from the rest of the international community. Therefore, sovereignty is accorded as a result of inviolable borders that protects nations and not regions, because regions are not granted independent sovereign legal representation. We say that as a result, self-determination is a right that should exist on a national level as opposed to on a regional level. Why is it in the imperative of the international community to recognize inviolable borders in sovereignty? Because sovereignty is important as they allow the international order to function. Without sovereignty, we couldn't have interstate negotiation or diplomacy. And to deny nations the right of control over territory over their inviolable borders is to invite international anarchy, the invitation to annexation and land grabs, because you deny the right of governments to say, I control this territory and I can protect this territorial integrity. How is their policy inconsistent with this international system as it stands? Because they will grant independent unilateral right of secession to regions. Regions aren't independent legal entities, and international law recognizes them as part of the sovereign territory of a whole nation. Therefore, there's no problem, for instance, when a national government agrees to this voluntarily. The problem comes when the national government disagrees, because what this policy does is they will allow a minority community within the government to impose legal control over a territory that belongs to the sovereign government and national government of the country. And they will allow this illusory right of a minority to a sovereign nation to impose on the justified legal sovereignty of an entire country. Therefore, on our side, they infringe on sovereignty and invite the international anarchy that we warn against in our substantive of annexations, land grabs, and endless conflict. Secondly, I'll argue in my second main point that seceding states are not independently viable. We argue that self-determination is actually conditional. It's granted for the practical endpoint of self-governance and independent management. Therefore, self-determination only makes sense when the state is able to manage itself independently and defend its sovereignty, and should be made conditional on the ability of that community to maintain independent viability. This is not the case with seceding states. We'll give you three reasons. Firstly, seceding states are often dependent on trade routes and foreign relations that are managed centrally by federal governments that they lose the moment they secede. Second, infrastructure of seceding states are often intrinsically linked with the economies of the parent state, and therefore these seceding nations cannot survive alone economically. For instance, 90% of Tibet's government revenue stems from federal funds in Beijing. The Abyei and the South Kordofan provinces are dependent on oil pipelines from Khartoum in Sudan. Therefore, these seceding states will not be able to survive economically and will result in economic disaster and disrepair. Lastly, we argue invasion will be inevitable on their side, because the seceding territory is viewed by the parent state as part of its territorial integrity, and therefore, they are worried that successful independence will lead to secession from other parts of the nation. Therefore, what will happen is otherization, whereas the parent state stigmatizes the other group, the other nation, as part of an ethnic minority that they are opposed to. For instance, the Serbians did that with the Albanian ethnic minority in Kosovo. Therefore, invasion will happen on their side, and the seceding state will be annihilated, because logically, the Chechenian militants would never survive in the face of Russian military invasion. Therefore, they don't even save a single life on their side, because seceding states cannot be independently viable, and they can't even defend their borders from the nations that are promoting the barbaric atrocities that they talk about. On our side, we argue self-determination is an instrumental tool, whereby you use self-determination to protect other rights, such as the right to life. And if on their side, seceding states are wrecked with economic disorder, disrepair, military conflict, and instability that cause millions of innocent lives to be lost, we argue that seceding states cannot be granted the right to self-determination. Therefore, please work with side opposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 8 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech. And I'll call upon the second speaker of the proposition to give the speech.
Given the inherent nature of this motion, opposition cannot argue solely on the practical ramifications of what happens after secession. What we told him within our first speaker was that the most important thing is the question of who decides whether they should secede or not. Crucially, this question has not been answered by their side. Therefore, by this point in the debate, they are not really arguing the heart of what matters in this motion. Opposition wanted to accuse us of a policy contradiction. Apart from the fact that this debate isn't even a policy debate in the first place, we agree. We have a very elastic principle of self-determination, and we are proud to stand by that fact. But when you look at the real world, which are the people, or the groups of people rather, who are most likely to secede? When you recognize that you have a democratic government that protects your majority of people, then more or less there's no incentive for the majority of your people to secede in the first place. More often than not, it's your minority communities, for instance, your Rohingya in Burma, or your Tibetans in China, who are systemically being discriminated against, and therefore is most prestigious to these people, because these are the people who are most affected. That's why their attack on a policy contradiction doesn't make any sense. No. We're going to deal with everything they told us in two very simple points of contention. First, on this entire notion of a national right to sovereignty, and secondly, on whether viability is even a question. First, on national right to sovereignty, they told you this occurs on a national level. Well, we questioned them very simply, because the only logic which they gave us within this was that there's no basis of this for international law. Well, very simply, what about all the minority communities that are living within these areas as well? Why is it that these people do not deserve any right to representation in government as well? It is more important that we consider all these minorities. Why is this the case? Because more often than not, these are the specific groups of people who cannot be represented within democracy. And it's because democracy has failed them that they need to undertake this measure. We recognize that yes, possibly this is a last resort for these people, because everything else so far has not worked. That is the reason, for instance, why Rohingya have faced continuous persecution in Burma allow for secession, which compromises on sovereignty if they have been abusive towards minorities. So for the bulk of the cases in which we are arguing, which are really the heart of math in today's world, opposition has conceded to all the logic which we've brought you. No thank you. Next issue. Is viability even a question? Now they told us that secession only makes sense when your state is able to survive, and more often than not they can't, because they're dependent on things like trade routes and many other things. But we're going to argue that regardless of all this logic, this really isn't the point of the matter. Why is this the case? Because regardless, even under their policy, regardless of whether there's something, hold on a moment, regardless of whether there's something which is economically viable or not, they allow everyone within the nation to still decide for it. Yes, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, we think that because these minorities tend to be oppressed and often belonging the most oppressive and the most heinous of regimes, it is likely that they will be inferior and the states are doomed to fail.
No, sir. This is where I bring on the next line of response, where he told us about the breakup of the entire nation, and then there's going to be otherization. Let's draw a very simple contrast. You have otherization either within a particular state, which means that these communities are systemically being oppressed and there's nothing they can do about it, or they exist as a separate nation, which means they have independent territorial borders, which means that the international community can come in and stop these kinds of things from happening. This is the direct comparative. It means, for instance, you have the Rohingya and Burma who can't do anything about it, or you have, for instance, Timor-Leste, which seceded from Indonesia, and therefore the Christians within that community are able to continue to protect themselves and avoid any form of otherization. This is the reason why it becomes so much better for all these minorities. So otherization exists a lot better when you exist as a separate state rather than within that same state. Therefore, that's not an issue. Now, no thank you. They told us about the breakup of the entire nation. Now, this in and of itself is something which is very unlikely. If your democracy is one which is not abusive towards the majority of your people, if it is, then we think it might be a good idea to break up, because then your democracy has failed within these countries. We don't think that's a bad thing. No thank you. Therefore, within that existing as a separate state entirely, that's a lot more good. What is more important is that they really didn't deal with the idea of representation that we brought in our first speaker. Now, why is this important? Because we told you that more often than not, for instance, within the Muslim majority in Indonesia, they can't represent the concerns and all the rights issues which are associated with the Christians within Timor-Leste. That is the very reason why Timor-Leste seceded from Indonesia. Therefore, given this notion of the lack of representation and how democracy has failed all these people, we think they're more than just in seceding. Therefore, because we've proven that these people are best placed to decide for themselves whether they should secede or not, it is definitely justified for them to have independent statehood. Therefore, I'm moving on to my first argument, which is going to be on incentivizing better governmental action. And the thrust of my argument is this, that the threat of secession incentivizes better government treatment of minorities. Why? Because when governments know that they could stand to lose entire regions through independent secession, they are incentivized to enact policies that cater to and protect minority groups. And this is because, hold on a moment, the loss of a single region means the loss of national territory. And this is seen as a threat to the nation. Therefore, they are more amenable to compromise and to accede to the requests of minorities, which tend to be things like concerns about equality and rights and opportunity. Why is this bad?
No, we think that most oppressive of governments are likely to disperse minorities to prevent them from being the critical masses.
Yes, well, at the very least, then within those regions, we still conduct elections on that local, national, regional level rather, so that they at least can try to report critical mass as compared to your side, where they have absolutely nothing which they can do at all. At the very least, our side gives them the chance of a better future by having a referendum only in that area in the first place. The comparative just suits our side a lot better. Moving back to my argument. Now, the threat of secession now poses a very important threat to governments, and this makes them sit up and pay attention to concerns of minorities. This is particularly important in cases where the region may eventually choose to vote against the secession because of the benefits accorded to them now, or sets a precedent for future government activity with regard to regions that are demographically distinct or have a possibility of secession. And the example for this is Timor-Leste, where after their successful secession from Indonesia in 2002, Indonesia feared losing even more territory, and as a result, the Indonesian government signed peace treaties with the Free Aceh movement in 2005 and granted autonomy to Aceh as a result, as well as the Riau Islands province, therefore creating better treatment for these communities. Therefore, because the threat of secession ensures better government policy, it should be internationally recognized. Second argument, on preventing terrorism. No. Giving regions the right to independent statehood directly prevents the escalation of terrorism. Now, if we deny them the ability to secede, they necessarily turn to violence, because this is seen as the only means to draw enough attention to their cause to threaten the government into caving into their demands. So, for instance, in Spain, you have the ETA's request for independent state for the Basque communities being rejected by the Spanish government. And this is the reason why they undertook terrorist activity with killing over 800 people through kidnappings and bombings. Clearly, their inability to attain independence has resulted in hundreds of unnecessary deaths. Similarly, the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front have had their independence requests ignored by India, and as a result, there was not only a 1989 insurgency, but it also spawned massive numbers of other terrorist groups, like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, that continue attacks against the Indian state till this very day. This is terrible because instead of negotiations and diplomacy, opposition would therefore force secessionists to turn to violence, to draw attention, and therefore gain more support, or get into a position of superiority from which they can therefore threaten the government. So much unnecessary destruction could be avoided very simply by giving them the right to independent statehood. Therefore, proposition is very proud to stand by the fact that when a man cannot choose, he ceases to be a man.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 2 seconds. I thank the Speaker for his speech. May I now call upon the second Speaker of the Opposition to give his speech.
There are three questions that I'm going to ask. First, why do we allow secession? Second, when do we allow secession? And third, what are the effects of secession? First, why do we allow secession? Proposition gave us three reasons to do so. First, because of self-determination. They said people need to construct a culture and identity for their own. We said you can do this in your own nation. We think it's anachronistic to assume that the nation is the only bearer of your culture. We think that cultures can be done within nations as well. For example, the creation of a distinct Hakka culture in China. Hence, even if you have the right to self-determination of your own culture, you do not have the right to create your own state to protect it. Because in the age of globalization, we think culture needs to be culture is subsumed under the state, which protects many different cultures and not just one. Secondly, they said different regions have different needs. Now first, let's make it clear, right? They will allow regions with the exact same needs as their parent government to secede as well. So it's not clear that this right applies to them. They didn't prove the whole scope of this motion. But secondly, we argue that the answer to this is democracy and federalism. In fact, the kind of states that they're talking about are often autonomous anyway. For example, Kurdistan already has the ability to take independent government policies because they're autonomous. So no, we don't think that different needs need to be met by a different state. We think that can be done in status quo. Lastly, they said the majority don't know what it's like for the minority. Guys, it's epistemically true, right? That I don't know what it's like for another person. This is an argument against all government because anybody governing you does not epistemically know what it's like to be you, right? So that their principle of logic extends to absurdity there. Next, Sweet told us that they rejected practical criteria for this debate. No, we think who decides who secedes is done by mutual agreement. So if the principle stance is clear. But secondly, why are practical concerns important? We argue that international law is based on rule utilitarianism, right? That's why we have borders, that's why states are combined to aggregate the demands of people. We think, therefore, that their policy results in anarchy and chaos is adopted as a rule. Because every state can secede, you lead to the balkanization of Europe, no thank you, and we think that's even worse. They said, we made a concession in our policy when we said we invade. No, my first speaker never said that. We said we can pursue means such as sanctions and diplomatic censure. We never said we invade, we call them out on that line. Lastly, they said you need representation. And to this we say, number one, they allow people in democracies and federal states to secede as well. So it's not clear how just a denial of representation means an automatic criteria to create your own state. But secondly, we think that your ability not to be represented is an argument to change your own government and not to form one of your own. And we're going to prove that makes things worse, which is why you shouldn't do that later. Second question, when do we allow secession? Yes.
At least as an independent state, they can at least get international aid and establish their own trade, as compared to they remain within your countries, where the international aid is pocketed and they cannot establish their own trade.
I'm going to deal with your argument later when I tell you how war makes things worse because of otherization. So listen up to that. When do we allow secession, right? First, we think that their policy was nebulous in the first place. They allow any group of people, no matter how small, to secede on their own. We think this makes for states that are doomed to fail. And why is this bad? Because your self-determination is hurt when your state cannot even protect you. When when your state cannot even protect your life, we don't think you can't determine what you want in that case. Therefore, we think that the parent state has sovereignty, because a minority cannot undemocratically decide which territory they want to steal from their parent state. Furthermore, their policy has no provisions for who decides what counts as an autonomous region, right? We think if minorities are allowed to draw their borders themselves, this leads to the fragmentation of states and undermines the sovereign territorial sovereignty of nations. Furthermore, we think the construction of a nation involves all people, not just the people who happen to be living on a particular piece of land within the nation. You don't have the right to decide what happens to your land just because you live there. We think only people in the state need to participate in that process. That's why it's a mutual agreement. Last question. What happens when secession, what will secession do? Here we argue that proposition doesn't actually save lives because of otherization, and this is where I deal with the point of information. No thank you. Because if nations are as barbaric as they claim, that they are the worst oppressors, we don't think they will have any forms about invading the new nation. Why is war worse? Number one, because in war, countries tend to use the full brunt of their military arsenal against the enemy, right? Because you can rally, it's very hard to rally tanks and aircraft to attack your own citizens because that isn't convincing. But it's easy to rally the full scope of arms and conduct full-scale oppression on another nation. Furthermore, we think like the example of the Rohingya it is now, right? Because we think Thailand will just invade whatever new Rohingya state, given that the Rohingya are kind of nomadic and have no domestic protections themselves. I'm going to be dealing with their two substantives on terrorism and incentivizing action within my own, and I'm going to integrate the responses, so listen up for that. My substantive is how this increases local oppression. We start from the premise, right? That parent states want to stop regions from seceding. No thank you, madam. Proposition tried to argue in the substantive that they will offer concessions, that they will improve economic ties. However, we think that if these nations are as barbaric as they claim, they're not going to help these regions that want to secede. They're going to prevent these regions from ever wanting to secede in the first place. How does this go? How are they going to do so? They're going to do so by denying three criteria. First, they're going to prevent majority support. Second, they're going to make these nations economically unviable. And third, they're going to make defense even worse. First, on majority support. We think nations will stop ethnic majorities from accumulating. They're going to use ethnic cleansing, just like the Iraqis did in Kurdistan. And their first proposition example falls on our side. Because we think that the Kurds conducted ethnic cleansing in Kurdistan to prevent the Kurds from ever seceding in the first place. Because the threat of secession made the Kurdish government want to remove the ethnic majority in the area. Second, we think there can be an influx of locals. In response to threats of Tibetan secession, China, I'll take it a moment, madam, allowed the families of soldiers garrisoned in Tibet to stay there as well, diluting the ability of the Tibetans to ever get a majority because the Chinese people there will also be counted as citizens of the land. Yes?
As an independent state, minorities can at least build up their own army, get military aid, a lot better when under your side, but have nothing to protect them at all.
Madam, we don't think any nation will be willing to protect a lot of these small states. Given the example of Crimea, given that NATO is rendered helpless in the face of an EU debt crisis and the US that is burdened with conflicts around the world, we don't think anybody, even if you want the UN intervention, will be able to do so because the nations most systemically likely to intervene for it, to be acting this way, like Russia and China, which just veto UNSC action. So moving on with my case. How will parent states make regions even more economically unviable? We think that parent states will cripple the economic viability of these regions because they control key oil pipelines or water supplies. We see Israel do this with Palestine, right? Where they prevent any foreign investment in Palestine except for select few organizations in order to cripple the Palestinian economy. Why do they do this? Because in order to prevent the Palestinian state from being created, they want to make it economically unviable. That's why we saw, for example, Israel blockade the Gaza to cut off all trade in Palestine. Third, on defense viability, and this is where I answered their substantive as well. We think that terrorism actually increases on their side because the call for unilateral secession empowers extremist groups in the independence movement more so than calls for mutual reconciliation, right? When the Basques go for mutual negotiations with the Spanish government, we think it helps moderates within the cause. However, calls for unilateral secession empower militant right-wing extremists, the very ones they wanted to talk about in order to rebel, to revolt against the Spanish government regardless of their consent. Hence, we think that's actually makes terrorism worse because they empower the most extremist elements within independence movements. For all these reasons, we think that proposition leads to oppression of minorities in states worse, even if it's bad now. We think that, for example, Thailand is going to continue to oppress the Rohingyas and prevent them from being able to succeed in the first place by occupying their land militarily before they can even hold a referendum. So we think these things work. For all these reasons, I'm proud to stand on opposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 4 seconds. I thank the Speaker for his speech. May I now call upon the third speaker of the proposition to give a speech.
International borders. Why is this important? Because it allows things like the UN
thank the speaker for her speech. May I now call upon the third speaker of the opposition to deliver this speech.
It is clear that by the end of this debate, side proposition had reduced their case to the most oppressive and the most violent of regimes. And the question about those regimes is this: are they likely to be the countries that respect international borders and will let the state peacefully secede? The answer is no. I'm going to analyze this debate by asking two questions. First of all, how do we conceptualize sovereignty and statehood? Secondly, which side better protects minorities? First of all, how do we conceptualize sovereignty and statehood? In our first speaker, we gave you two different conceptions of self-determination and statehood. We told you that, first of all, sovereignty is the prerogative of states and not of regions. Their response: people need independent statehood because governments don't accurately represent or protect their culture. First of all, let's ask a question. Is independent statehood really necessary for cultural protection? No. You can carry out your cultural practices and exercise your self-identity within the framework of a state, even if you're talking about regions that want to or are likely to secede. We give you the example of Scotland, where the Highland and the Lowland Scots can practice their own self-identity and their own culture within legal government frameworks, even though they desire secession. Ladies and gentlemen, we think it's fallacious for them to argue that pursuing your self-identity within a culturally different state is impossible. In multicultural nations like Singapore, cultures can coexist without needing self-governance. Therefore, they've reduced this debate to the most oppressive and the most heinous of regimes in a minority of cases. And we argue that this principle becomes essentially unlimited. Would you let a group of 100 people form a state and fracture if they desire their own identity and because they affirmed it? Europe would, under their model, under their paradigm, will be broken up into 1,000 ethnically distinct units and compartments, fractured and divided based on ethnic or cultural lines. Clearly, this is the kind of balkanization that we don't support because it only leads to the breakdown of nations and the breakdown of the international world order. What is our alternative? We think that states, through perhaps the use of international pressure, should pursue federalization and devolution. We give you the example of the United Kingdom about how China already grants autonomous provinces and the right of nations like Ningxia or Tibet to some degree of autonomy. And we think that minorities can then pursue change organically on the ground within their own parent state. But then they told us that no, this is a contradiction because we consider that minority nations should have some degree of autonomy. First of all, we think that autonomy in the cases of countries like the UK and China was granted on the basis of mutual agreement. This is not the case when we're talking about unilateral secession, which is what this debate is focused on. Secondly, our second conception of self-determination was that it is linked to economic viability. There is no value in upholding your right to sovereignty if your nation is likely to fail. Because there's no such thing as a natural right to sovereignty, but it's rather an instrumental right to protect all your other rights and privileges. My first speaker told you this and they did not give a coherent answer down the line. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why we cannot set up nations that are doomed to fall into invasion and famine. But let's take this argument one step further. We put to you that your identity and your culture are inextricably linked to your economic and your social status, right? Because only when you feel economically uplifted and only when you can protect yourself and have faith in a state that can protect you, can you really celebrate your culture and your identity in a special way. No thank you. So, I've proven to you why, first of all, sovereignty is the prerogative of not nations, not regions, but nations, and second of all, why sovereignty is instrumental to your ability to uplift yourself as an economic unit. Therefore, if we have proved to you why minority regions are systemically likely to be unable to uplift themselves and unable to be militarily sustainable, we take this debate. So let's move on to the second point of clash. Who protects minorities? We told you why states which unilaterally secede are doomed to fail due to the imminent threat of invasion, and therefore they don't protect minorities. Yes?
Military aid, forming your own army, contrasted to rebel groups who don't even have proper arms. Tell us which side protects minorities.
will be able to build up their own independent and strong military to face up the threat of China in a short period of time. So it's simply impossible, in the vast majority of cases, for nations to defend themselves. But okay, if they're about to engage us about the most abusive of countries, and for such as Russia and China, we put to you that their response, that they are violating international law and international borders, just as a step. Why? Because we put to you that in the modern world, it's unlikely that nations like Russia and China really care about international borders or international law. Well, thank you. Let's just look at how Russia unilaterally intervened in Tibet without international backing. We give you an example of how Russia unilaterally intervened in Crimea without international backing, about how China intervened in Tibet in 1951, even though it was in contravention directly of international law. We think that in these violent and oppressive regimes, where minorities are subject to suppression, these regimes aren't the ones that directly understand or respect international borders. The next thing they told us was that, no, we can simply carry out intervention, like we did in Timor-Leste. Well, the question we posed to them in our second speaker, which they did not really give us an answer to, is who on earth is going to carry out this intervention, given that the US is very war-weary and fatigued due to its continuous interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. President Obama seems to be reluctant to engage in any other kind of military intervention anywhere in the world, when most of the EU and the USA are saddled by problems like debt. We think that no one else out there that is available and is willing to carry out military intervention to protect these countries. Yes? No, madam. We think in the vast majority of cases, this wasn't unilateral secession. For example, in the case of Singapore, it was bilateral secession. Many of these nations did agree and succeed with the consent of parent countries. So we can't give us an example of countries like Singapore or Fiji. The single example they kept on repeating was Timor-Leste. They told us that East Timor seceded and was protected by the international community. Guys, the reason why the UN had to intervene in East Timor was simply because of a bloody civil war caused in the wake of its secession, and many people and minorities perished as a result of what happened. So ladies and gentlemen, we think it's an example for our side, because more minorities tend to be harmed. No thank you. Then they told us that no, international borders makes things better because unlike regional demarcations, they are more formalized. No, we think that regional demarcations and borders make things worse. Why is that so? Because it's much easier for a nation to otherize a minority when they are not in the same state as them. It is much easier to rally hatred and rally widespread popular sentiments towards abuse when you are no longer part of the same country, because there is no longer any national narrative that unifies you. It is much easier to otherize members of minority countries if they don't belong, no thank you, to the same country as you, because we have to understand that fundamentally, nations are often defined in relation to what they are not. And once you allow minorities to secede, it becomes far easier for oppressive governments to rally against them and garner more rhetoric against them. We think that on the comparative, our side is better. Why? Because it is easier to use international pressure to make countries more amenable to change and minority representation. That was the alternative we championed from our first speaker. We told you, furthermore, in our second speaker, why we encourage states to disperse and to harm minorities. They told us that no, we can simply have referendums to solve this problem. We just have the referendums faster. This was ignoring my second speaker's remarks that states will try to prevent the minorities from forming movements or forming any kind of self-identity in the first place. They are likely to engage in acts of forceful deportment or relocation like we saw in China, or they are likely to simply clamp down even harder on these minorities to prevent and preclude the possibility that they will form an independent state. Simply going in there and having a fast referendum is infeasible in the modern world, given that no one is going to enforce it. Then they said we didn't respond to our argument about terrorism, so let me deal with that right now. We think the vast majority of terrorists, like Tamil tigers, fight for other political purposes and ideological purposes than simply forming an independent state, right? And these are purposes and these objectives are likely to diminish even if we grant them the right to independent statehood. Ladies and gentlemen, because they only wish to debate in the most oppressive of cases, but it was in these cases where secessionist movements were likely to be the most unsustainable. Go with the team from our
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 1 second. I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now call upon the reply speaker of the opposition to give his speech to conclude his team's case for the debate.
There were two worlds in this debate. There was this misguided team proposition that ignored the realities of today, that championed rights above everything else, yet lost their way in trying to really protect the ones that they cared about. In In contrast, there was the clear vision of team opposition which recognized that though this world wasn't perfect, we stopped things from getting worse. What was the world of proposition? It was a world where they championed self-determination for everybody, for all states. They gave us this reason, that because when representation fails, you deserve a right to your own state. We told you how when representation fails, that's a reason for changing your state, not a legal basis for creating your own nation. No response. But they gave us another reason why we should be able to secede. Because regions are different. They have different cultures. They have different identities. But when pushed and challenged, when we said culture and identity can be found within a state and not in your own state, because that was an anachronistic conception of what a state was, they were silent. Because they refused to confront the fact that their policy allowed people in democracies with full autonomy to secede from their parent nations as well. So they conceded the vast majority of nations who weren't oppressive. Because their criteria, by third proposition, was you need to secede to escape oppression. Ignoring all the other times when, for example, the only reason the Basque region in Spain wants to secede is A, a different culture, and B, like slightly higher poll taxes, right? We don't think that counts as oppression in the worst cases they want to talk about. So they lose the majority of examples in this debate. In response to democracies and federal states, we said they have their own culture within their nation. And in response, we don't think we heard anything else. So in the majority of cases where there is an oppression, they haven't proved their right to secede, because you can form your own identity and self-determine outside your own nation. So let's talk about oppression. They said we need to be able to secede to save lives. Unfortunately, we proved how this didn't save lives. Because even when talking about dictatorships, we told you that it was these same dictatorships that were engaged in all-out war, that would drag out their tanks and missiles and airplanes to bomb other sovereign nations. Because an all-out war that was between states was far worse than using your own military against your own people. Because it was harder to convince other people to oppress your own citizens rather than different people from a different state who took away your land and stole it for their own purposes. They talked about Timor-Leste, the one example they wanted to talk about. Here we told you that East Timor secession led to years of conflict. And if this scenario happened to, for example, Crimea or any other country like Tibet, we think the UNSC will be unable to intervene because of the veto powers of Russia and China. No response on their side. In fact, their work incentivized further oppression, because Israel, who made Palestine even more crippled under their policy. Rohingyas in Burma would be even more oppressed under their model. So our work was better. Why? Because we recognized that international law was not just about doing the right thing all the time, but about rule utilitarianism. That we wanted to create the best laws that led to the best future all across the world. We recognized that borders were arbitrary, that they were hard to do, but that this was stable and that this prevented the most conflict. We recognized the sovereignty of governments. Notice how the only reason why they rejected the sovereignty of national government was based on dictatorships, conceding that democracies had secessionist movements too. Democracies deserve the right to sovereignty, right? And we argue that dictatorships deserve this too, because yes, we can help by other means like economic sanctions and like negotiation, but this did not lead to a legal right to create your own state. We recognize that we created viable states who had economies, who were not in poverty, and that was true self-determination. Because you couldn't determine your identity or conception of your state when it was struggling to feed all its members in society. We recognize that a country breaking up had to have the participation of all its citizens, not just the ones who happen to live in particular plots of land at particular plots of time. Because countries were made by different people and you had to involve everybody in that process of separation. In trying too hard to protect seceding nations' rights, proposition had no nation left.
Spoke for 4 minutes and 3 seconds. I thank the speaker for his speech. May I now call upon the reply speaker of the proposition to give this speech to conclude this team's case as a whole.
For all of opposition's attacks about oppressive regimes being a minority of states, it is peculiar that most of their case itself was predicated on these very states, and their only positive examples of democracy and secessionist vote were about Scotland, which incidentally is also having its own independent vote in their own associate or dissociate yourself from a particular group of people. In this case, a nation in its entirety. And their response was very poor. They just told us that your right to your identity doesn't lead to your right to a state. But we questioned it. Why is this the case? Especially in countries where having a particular identity more or less constitutes a crime. And we gave you numerous examples of where this is the case. Talk about Burma and numerous other instances where your right to identity is something which is compromised on each and every day of your life. No response to this. And here we brought our idea of representation, that democracy has failed to protect these minorities, and therefore this democracy is not something which is suitable for them. Opposition was incredibly serious. They told us that this is an argument against democracy because no one can perfectly be represented. No, this was not the case. What they were essentially arguing for was that since nobody can actually be represented properly, either you have absolutely no democracy or you restore the British Empire. Now, this in and of itself wasn't really something that Proposition wanted to stand for, and therefore we told you that regardless of how well you think you can protect the minority, if the minority themselves thinks that you don't represent them well, then too bad, you don't represent them well, and that is why they have the right to have their independent state, so that they can continue to protect themselves and their identity. Regardless of whether it was about their culture or their ability to live, we told you that it's the right of those people living in that area to decide for themselves, not for someone else to force their choice upon them. They then told us that, oh no, these people can choose their own government. Really, tell that to all the minorities who are systematically being oppressed, killed, and murdered every single day of their life. We gave you numerous examples. How did our policy solve, how did our side rather solve this? We told you consistently that as an independent state, even if there's some form of otherization, at least remove them yourself from that community. And then maybe we transition to the second area, therefore, about protecting minorities. Because they told us that wars are going to exist. Well, this is the comparative. On our side, you declare war against another state. On their side, they could just do very quietly by doing it within their own state. Therefore, the likelihood of a war was something which was a lot lower on our side of the house as compared to systematic discrimination being hidden on their side of the house. What was more important was that they considered the notion of autonomy. But they told us that yes, people can live independently in a separate area because you can't represent them. Therefore, they should have the right to their own government. This was an important concession because this was a very small line away from actually granting them an independent state. And we questioned them. If you want to give them autonomy, then why not give them an independent state of their own? And they had no response to this whatsoever except to say some territory is going to be lost. We really didn't accept this, and we told you the multiple benefits that come out of result. First of all, we told you about saving lives. Why in and of itself, war is something a lot less likely as compared to systemic discrimination within a country. No response to that one. More importantly, we told you about terrorism. They only told us that terrorism will still happen. They failed to address the root cause of terrorism. That is because you denied secession, the right to secession rather, to this country. That is the reason why terrorism happened in the first place. And by avoiding terrorism, also incentivize better government action for all these minorities. Therefore, Proposition was very proud to stand by the fact that the people living within these regions are the masters of their fate and should be the captains of their soul.
Speakers spoke for 4 minutes and 13 seconds. We would now like to invite Mr. Mark Gabriel, the Chief Adjudicator of the MOE ACJC Intercollegiate Debating Championship, to provide his observations about the finals, as well as to announce the results of the finals. Mr. Mark Gabriel, please.
We certainly had an interesting debate this afternoon, provided by the two teams who are now seated in front of us on the stage. We've had the teams sitting here on the stage for a while. There's a reason why, at this tournament and many others, we have the speakers seated on the stage while all these announcements are made. It's largely for the entertainment of the audience. You get to see some nice things like the winning team celebrating. You also get to see as one or two things are said that might give the result away but don't quite. You get to watch the tortured expressions on their faces. And as you probably noticed, judges tend to like to, particularly when it comes up to the final moment when you announce the winning team in a debate, take a little bit of a pause and build up dramatic effect. And then finally you say the first word of the winning school and it's all clear. Today that might even get dragged further out. Since the first two words of the winning school won't actually tell you anything. But we'll come to that in a minute. This was an interesting debate. I mean, this is a motion that I think probably many people would agree is quite topical at the moment. There's a number of things in the news, particularly a lot of, in the international news, a lot of build-up to a referendum that's happening later this year in Scotland as to whether they should secede from the United Kingdom. There's also been a lot in the news of the issues in Crimea and whether they want to separate from Ukraine, either become part of Russia or become a sovereign state. It's something that was interesting, I think, as a motion based on the current international scene. But what we had in this debate was two teams that decided largely to focus on certain types of situations where becoming an independent state might be appropriate. I think it would be fair to say we particularly focused on situations where severe and significant repression and oppression is going on in certain regions. It didn't really focus on situations like the current situation in Scotland, where you wouldn't say there's any particularly severe oppression going on, but nevertheless there is a feeling that, at least on some people in Scotland, that there is a cultural divide that might make them want to become a separate state. I think that probably applies to other situations that did get briefly mentioned in this debate, such as the Basque region in Spain. But the two teams decided really to focus this debate on situations where there is significant oppression, and that would be the reason for wanting to become an independent state. And at times, interestingly, both teams accused the other of forcing the debate onto that ground. But in reality, as judges, we felt both teams clearly, through the way the debate progressed, had decided to focus the debate in that particular context on those particular situations. So despite the fact they both occasionally criticized each other for doing so, we think both teams really jointly made that decision, and therefore we judged the debate that was in front of us, one that was particularly focused on situations where we're looking at quite significant levels of oppression of a minority group focused in a particular region, and that might be the reason for their wanting to be independent statehood. Then I think it was a debate that focused also on both a mixture of principled and practical arguments. Again, at times both teams criticized each other for taking a particular focus, but it was one that the judges felt that quite legitimately and reasonably could focus on both areas. But we had a proposition team that focused their case largely on the principled case behind this motion, an opposition team that focused their case largely on the practical reasons why it wouldn't work. There was some engagement on both, but neither team we felt fully engaged as much as we would have quite liked to have seen with the cases that the other team brought up, and again at times criticized each other for having that focus. So there were some very good principled arguments that came from the proposition. There were some very good practical arguments that came from the opposition. Some engagement we would have perhaps liked to have seen a little bit more. So what did this debate in the end come down to? Well, if we look at the principal areas first, there were a couple of areas that were brought in by the proposition looking at how certain cultures can be particularly oppressed and how certain cultures can be particularly oppressed, but people should have the right to make their own decision as to whether they want to form an independent state on principled grounds in order to protect that. Then we also had arguments about that I think originated from the opposition, but also came into debate about the whole idea of autonomy. Is this in principle enough, or is creating an entirely separate state something that is quite legitimate and that groups should have the right to make that call if they want to? And interestingly then, when it came to the proposition's defense of that, it was perhaps on more practical grounds, that it would in fact be an incentive for central governments to look after these minorities if they knew there was a possibility of them succeeding. But we felt there were some quite good principled arguments raised by that from the proposition. In terms of the practical arguments that we heard coming from the opposition side, they were particularly focused on what is going to be the reaction of central governments to this. Is it in fact going to lead to more oppression? Can we really expect outside entities like the United Nations and some of the major powers in this world to come forward and protect these states, even if they are on principle forming separate states under entirely correct means? There was quite a well-developed and interesting practical case raised by the opposition. What did we have as a response to that coming from the proposition? Well, we got, well, maybe this is an incentive for them to hold that referendum a little bit more quickly and succeed even more quickly before that oppression can fully take place. Slightly brief argument, but it was reasonably well made. What did we get in response responding to that from the opposition? Well, then the government will just oppress them even more quickly. We felt, yeah, there was quite a good practical case built up there. A reasonable but rather rushed response from the proposition, an even more rushed response right at the end in terms of re-rebuttal coming from the opposition. So where did that leave us? Ultimately, we had two teams that, in terms of the areas that they particularly focused on the debate, did a good job. We have to look at where that engagement came, even though we would have liked to have seen a little bit more of it, but which team just had the edge. Other very slight things had an effect as well. Stylistically, and style is an important element of debate. It's not the be-all and end-all, but we did feel, while we saw 6 very good public speakers, there were a couple of speakers who could have done with slowing down a little bit, helping us to be able to follow some of their arguments, whereas some other speakers really seemed to hold and captivate this audience and got the pacing of their speeches very nicely. Other little things may have had some effect. The way the cases were structured, some speeches were a little bit easier to follow, and aspects, perhaps of one team's case, were just a little bit more clearly set out from the beginning, making the whole case easier to follow. It was very minor things that swung this debate. It wasn't a unanimous decision in the end. In the end, the adjudicators decided which team had won based on a 4-1 split decision among our panel. But I'll tell you first who the adjudicators thought was the best individual speaker of the grand final. And that was the second speaker from Anglo-Chinese Junior College, Samuel Wittberger. And the adjudicators were agreed. It was a good, close debate. It was little things that swung it. In the end, by a 4-1 majority, the panel of 5 adjudicators decided that the winners of this grand final and the champions of the Anglo-Chinese Junior College Ministry of Education Intercollegiate Debating Championship 2014 is the team from Anglo-Chinese Junior College.